my great pleasure, therefore, to hand over to Dr. Paul Penn.
Thanks very much, Ian, for the very kind words. Thanks to James as well for doing the MC stuff there. That's a new job for you, James, I think now, henceforth. It's wonderful to be with you all. I've been really anxious to do this lecture. I mean, not least because of 2 years being cooped up with COVID and talking to a screen. So being the rampant egomaniac that I think a lot of lecturers secretly are, wanted to get him back in front of a crowd again. It's wonderful to be here. It's particularly weird to be given a lecture with John in the audience, though, because when I was an undergraduate here back at UEL, and we're talking 95 to 98, my memory stretches back that far, the first person who actually gave a lecture in front of us was John himself. And he was introducing the school, and of course he started by introducing himself as an emeritus professor. And everyone in the audience at that point looked at each other and went, "What's an emeritus professor?" Ever the professional, without blinking, John saw the disquiet and said, "It means they don't pay me anymore." So, yeah, that's what the audience response was. Now, I do have to put that in context, however, because John was immediately followed by a representative from occupational psychology that evidently had just got off the phone with one of their trainees, who informed them that they now didn't get out of bed in the morning for anything less than £2,000 a day. This was back in 1995, at which point the audience did exactly what you've done, which is stunned silence. Now, bear in mind, you have to adjust that figure for inflation, which, what's that these days, in $1 million or something like that, probably, yeah? Well, actually, probably more like 5 million, let's be honest, the way things are going at the moment. So, we have an incredibly distinguished and incredibly remarkable career in teaching and learning that, you know, eventually they won't pay you anymore. And you have occupational psychology, a trainee that was claiming to get £2,000 a day. Well, I weighed up the options, and I decided a career in teaching and learning was for me. So clearly I'm not that smart, and you probably shouldn't listen to a bloody word I say, quite frankly, but, you know, we'll give it a go anyway. In today's session, I don't think I can really build too much on what Ian said, so I'll just give you the short story. Lecturing over about 15 plus years, as I have, and lecturing to psychology students, one of the things that struck me was how often I would see people study in a way that, let's be polite, certainly wasn't informed by psychological research. And of course, psychological students are looking at things like memory, attention, motivation. So these should be the first people that are clued up about these things. In fact, quite often people were studying in ways that would be actively discouraged by research in psychology. And I really wanted to do something about this. I thought we certainly can't have psychology graduates emerging from UEL not knowing how to study effectively. That's not good for anyone. But it also got me thinking about the fact, well, if psychology students are not doing this effectively, what about organic chemistry students? What about English literature students? What about everyone else? So I started to think maybe I could make a contribution there. So after that, I also observed that when I talk to students about their university experience, quite often they'd say, "I love university, but the studying sucks." And I was thinking, well, that's kind of why you're here, to be honest. And if you view studying as something that must be endured rather than enjoyed, that's kind of sad, isn't it, really? So that was one of the reasons I kind of started doing lectures on this, and that quickly resulted in me thinking, well, I should probably write a book, shouldn't I? And well, I should probably do a YouTube channel, shouldn't I? I did it the wrong way. I should have wrote the YouTube channel before the book and generated a bit of interest, because, you know, there you go. But I didn't do that. So that's really where I come from and what I'm trying to achieve. So what I'll do, and I'm using a clicker and technology here, so this could all go very wrong very quickly. What I'll do is give you a quick overview of today's session. We don't have a huge amount of time together, so I've got to crack on. First bit, I'm going to try and convince you that we actually need a psychology of effective studying as opposed to a study skills module or something along those lines. And the reason I think we need a psychology of effective studying is twofold. The one I've just talked about, which is if we give advice on studying, it really should be informed by research on memory, attention, motivation, things like that. That just stands to reason. The other reason we need psychology is to persuade people that they even need the help in the first place, which might come as a bit of a shock, but I'll expand on that as we progress. The more astute and cynical of you will also notice that this is a perfect opportunity for me to use legit psychological research to flog my book and the YouTube channel. And I make no apologies for that, because if you write a book as an academic, I remember having a conversation with a friend, and he said, do you know what happens when you produce an academic book, Paul? I went, no, what happens? And I was hoping he'd say they throw bags of money at you or something like that. Do you know what he actually said? I'll tell you what happens. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I said, well, thanks very much for that. You could have told me that before I wrote the damn thing, though, couldn't you? But there you go. So we're going to follow that up by me completely undermining the utility of trying to actually get you to buy the book by giving stuff away for free. I'm actually going to give you about sort of 5 or 6 pieces of advice on 4 different areas of studying that should hopefully really help you out. And that's why I studied psychology and not business studies, because giving stuff away for free if you're trying to flog stuff is probably not a good idea, is it really? And lastly, we get to the take-home messages, but I've got 3 take-home messages which, if you remember nothing else about this lecture, I would like you to take away with you. At this point, most of you, including me, are thinking, if you could do it in 2 slides and 3 messages and 5 minutes, why are you keeping this here for an hour, Paul? And the answer to that is, I don't have a good answer, to be honest with you. I've never known why we do that. But anyway, I suppose it's a value for money thing. You'd feel a bit cheated if you were here for 5 minutes. So, first things first, question for you all. Do you actually ever remember being taught how to study? And the entire room at this point goes, no, no. And I'm guessing you certainly weren't taught with reference to psychological material or anything like that, right? This is interesting because we are in a room now that I can tell you contains quite a lot of very high-powered academics, some wonderfully capable and committed and dedicated students who are all studying for a higher qualification, and yet none of you can remember being taught how to do the thing that brings you to the party. It's particularly alarming for the lecturers, isn't it? Well, it's good that we don't train other people like pilots. Can you imagine? So you've got a degree in aeronautical engineering, aerospace engineering. Do you actually know how to fly this plane? What's the worst that could happen? Cancel the holidays to Tenerife. Thank you very much. But this isn't just lecturers. If you just take a straw poll of anyone and you say, do you remember being taught how to study? They'll all say the same thing. Not really. Do any of you recognise this? I see lots of winces and raised eyebrows and tucks and things. So you do. You weren't taught how to study, but you have been exposed to this idea of learning styles, this idea that we process information either using sight, sound, or touch. We have a preference for one of those modalities, and the best way to teach us is to tap into that modality. You've heard of that, right? And those of you that follow my videos know where I'm going with this. It's not going to be pretty, folks. The next one. Anyone has seen something like this? Maybe that exact version for the learning pyramid. Yep, I'm getting nods around the room. Some people shaking their heads. Okay, there's lots of different versions. They all do the same thing. They rank learning activities according to how much information they say you retain from taking part in those activities. Okay, at the top, quite alarmingly, is lecture. Oh, that sucks, doesn't it? So if you don't like the lecture, well, you remember 5% of it. It's fine. We'll be okay. Complete poppycock, both of them. Okay, and I am serious. This one on the right is particularly egregious because there was a study not so long ago, actually, that tried to trace the origins of that learning pyramid. And they traced versions of it back about 120 years, during which time not one shredder's evidence has emerged for it. Out of desperation, the author of that study actually contacted this national teaching laboratory in Bethnal, Maine, and said, are you actually responsible for that? And they said, yes, we are. They said, fantastic, pay dirt. Can you give us the data upon which this is based? No, we kind of lost it, sir. Learning styles. Well, I can tell you about 20 or 30 years worth of psychology now says that's complete nonsense. You do have preferences for how you learn. They usually don't have anything to do with what works and what doesn't work. Okay? And yet, most of you are familiar with these things. So let's recap what we've got so far. None of you were really taught how to learn according to psychological research, at the very least. A lot of you have been exposed to complete misinformation and poppycock about learning. Here's where it gets really sinister, folks. 2020, there was a meta-analysis done. For those of you that are not familiar with meta-analysis, it's like a collection of studies on a topic. They pull the analysis and they look for trends from lots of research on the same topic. Okay? This study was very, very large. It was international, about 18 different countries, about 18,000 educators. So these are people that teach. As you can see, the best part of 90% of those people felt that their teaching would be more effective if they tailored it towards learning styles. So let's recap where we are now. Lots of people don't get formal instruction about learning. Lots of people are aware of a lot of misinformation about learning. And the people that are responsible sometimes for teaching future generations are kind of tacitly perpetuating and, well, undermining people's education by orientating it towards complete misinformation. Oh, this is not a very good start, is it? Am I convincing you we need a psychology of effective studying just yet? Okay, if not, let's just consider what the implications of not knowing what psychology has to say about studying are. It's interesting that one of John's books, I think the title alluded to this, it's the things you don't know, or the things you know that aren't true that get you into trouble. That happens to be one of my favourite quotes. It's often attributed to Mark Twain, but apparently it's not. Okay? It's not the things we don't know that get us into trouble, it's the things we know that ain't so. If you were a student and you believed in learning styles and you've been trying all this time to orientate your learning towards visual processing or kinesthetic processing or auditory processing and failing miserably, you're going to think it's you, aren't you? You'll think, I'm following evidence-based stuff, it's not working, I must be a bit dense. Not helpful. Okay? So it's not without consequences stuff. I'll give you a really embarrassing personal example from my own life. Okay? Imagine 16-year-old Paul, not a pleasant image, I know, doing his geography GCSE exam. It was a proper public exam. Most of you will wince when I start describing this. Held in the school gymnasium. That horrible combination of dust and polished wood in the air. That really oppressive silence that when you walk into the room, it hits you in the face. It's almost like it's got density. Yeah? These rows of perfectly arranged Victorian desks. I sat down nervously at my desk, complete with the inkwell that hasn't been used for about 4 generations, yeah? Shuffled the papers nervously and unveiled a bit of graffiti. This, word for word, is what the graffiti said. Yep. Quite unnerving when you're about to take one of the big exams in your life. I'd swatted like a champ for this exam, so I went in pretty confident. I didn't leave confident. In fact, what I wanted to do was underneath this write Me Too 1993, basically, just as a record for future candidates. So this kind of stuff does matter, but sometimes people say, well, look, Paul, we don't get taught about this stuff. There's a lot of misinformation out there. There are a lot of well-intentioned educators that are peddling rubbish, unfortunately. But maybe learning is one of those things that is so important, that is so pervasive in our lives, we just kind of figure it out and we end up at the right destination, whether we kind of meant to or not. Well, we can test that hypothesis, can't we? All we have to do is look at the research that studies how students actually go about studying and compare that to what psychology says works. And if people do get it right, we should find that students are using the most effective methods naturally, yeah? What do you think is going to happen? Yeah, I can see the smiles around the room. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can now see a table. On the left-hand side of that table, there are some very commonly used approaches to studying. At this point, you will note probably 3 things, actually. Who recognises some of those approaches to studying? Yeah, OK, right, OK. Who's looked at those and gone, I use some of those approaches to studying? I definitely did. Who's going, hang on a minute, those approaches that I use also have low next to them. What does that mean? Yeah? Well, that's as good as you can get in academia, a one-word summary of what the research in psychology and across the learning sciences says about the utility or usefulness of those methods. Ah, right, OK, that doesn't look good, does it? So what are students actually using? Well, according to a very sort of prominent study by Karpicki et al., you can see there that 83% of students reported that rereading was their #1 go-to strategy, what they use most frequently. Well, that's got a low next to it. That don't sound good. In contrast, 10% of students said practice testing was their go-to study strategy, which is the one that's got a high next to it. So you can see immediately, can't you, that there is a discrepancy between what students think works, and therefore what they use, and what psychology would advocate using. And this is because of something called metacognition, and particularly faulty metacognition. Now, metacognition basically means, the crudest definition I can give you is thinking about thinking, which sounds like a really academic, in the worst sense of the word, thing to talk about, yeah? But it's actually vital. Think about it this way. Your attempts to learn are going to be inextricably tied to your perception of what you already know. If you already think you know something, are you going to bother really studying it extensively? Probably not. If you're pretty confident you know something, then again, are you going to study it? If you don't know something, you're probably going to pay it more attention, aren't you? Okay? Question, what if you're wrong? What if your ability to monitor what you know and what you don't know effectively is flawed? Spoiler alert, it is, significantly. Okay? One of the reasons for this is, and I'll give you an early example of metacognitive error now, we tend to confuse study strategies that are easy to implement and easy to use with the ones that are effective. Think about things like rereading, dead simple, isn't it? Just reread things over and over again. And as you do that, what happens? It starts to feel, subjectively at least, familiar, doesn't it? What happens when you're tested on that material without the source in sight? That feeling of familiarity suddenly becomes completely illusory and evaporates, doesn't it? Okay? And we don't take these kind of things into account. Really good literature here. I've given you a nice reference there called Desirable Difficulties by Bob and Elizabeth Björk, an amazing team of cognitive psychologists that have looked at this kind of issue for many, many years now. The problem with this, and the point I'm trying to get at here, is it's the things that are ineffective that generally feel like they're effective, and the things that are effective that generally feel like they're not working very well because they're hard work. Okay? And that's what you've got to be careful of. And you've particularly got to be careful because if you already think you're good at something, what's the likelihood you think you're going to need much help with it? You're probably not, aren't you? Okay? Now, hopefully we'll get to the next slide here. This is where I say that why people need convincing. If your metacognition is telling you, I already know this stuff, I'm already good at this stuff, you're probably not going to seek help, are you? So when someone offers help, you're probably not going to be hugely receptive to it. And that's what I found when I first started doing sort of psychology of effective studying. People were, I wouldn't say hostile, but extremely reticent to take part in it. I always felt like it was very much a marketing job. I felt like Homer Simpson in this clip. I'm about to use a video, folks. The whole world might crash now. Let's see if it works. This is kind of how I felt. Homer here is trying to sell a homemade aphrodisiac and not doing particularly well.
Sir, hello, sir. Yes, you look like a man who needs help satisfying his wife. So,
But the point there is people generally don't like to be told that they're not doing something well that's important to them. Think about this from a student perspective as well. You've arrived at university, you've got good enough grades to get into university, and suddenly someone like me comes and says, you might want to tweak your studying a bit. Your immediate reaction is, I think I'm all right, Paul. Yeah? Now, this is where it all goes wrong. Oh, thank goodness for that. There we go, we're fine. Another reason that people can be reluctant to take part in this stuff is because, well, how did you feel when you started university? Does the word overwhelmed ring any bells to you? The amount of reading you have to do and things like that. Well, that's common. In the literature from student transitions between further and higher education, one of the consistent themes is, how do you do all of this reading? Okay? Now, someone like me comes along and says, I know you're an organic chemist. I know you've got a lot on in your curriculum, but I want you to read a bit about psychology as well to help you study. What are you going to say? No, sorry, Gov, I haven't got time for it. Okay? And of course, what you're doing there is exactly what's depicted in that picture. You're making your life harder in the long term. You're studying less efficient by not engaging just because you think, I can't deal with this initially. By the way, it's a complete myth that higher retaining students spend a lot longer studying than lower retaining counterparts. You can probably guess where I'm going with this. They just spend their time differently. Okay? They spend their time doing the things that I'm going to tell you about in the shortly to come second part of the lecture. Okay? Third reason I think people often need convincing, and why we don't just say, do this, don't do this, do this, don't do this, is because if I said the word study skills to you now, what's your immediate reaction? Be honest. Can't say I blame you. That picture actually is was taken by a disgruntled lecturer and sent to a national newspaper because they'd arranged a session to go over revision advice and marking criteria for a forthcoming examination. And as you can see, they were killed in the rush of students to attend the lecture. Right, do you think all of those students actually were prepared properly for those exams, or do you think they're suffering from metacognitive errors? I would say they're probably suffering from a few metacognitive errors there. But I think the other reason as well is that, I mean, let's be honest with this stuff. I mean, we say to students, When you come to university, it's all about evidence. Okay? You've got to use the literature. You've got to use evidence. You've got to formulate arguments based on evidence. And then, how do we teach study skills quite often? We just say, do this, don't do this. Now, at the very best, that looks hypocritical. At the worst, because you're not telling students to do the very thing you're advising them to do in their degree subject, it just looks like you're full of it, quite frankly, doesn't it? Okay, so that's another reason. And I think the final reason, and this is the most damning one, is people tend to think this stuff is just remedial. You engage with this stuff if you are failing, and only. And that's something I really want to contest, because having that view of psychology of effective studying is a bit like saying, I only take my car to the garage when it breaks down. Well, that's one reason to take it to the garage, but perhaps if you took it to the garage to be serviced, i.e. tuned up, i.e. optimised, it will run better and it will have less chance of breaking down. And that's how I'd encourage you to start thinking about using psychology to improve your studying. Okay? It's not to stop you from failing, it's to maximise and optimise what you're doing. So what we end up with is this conflation of things, metacognitive errors, practical concerns, that make students completely incredulous that they could actually benefit from this stuff and make them a bit hostile. And the way that I like to sort of illustrate that to students is to show this clip. We're back to a video again, folks. Let's hope it works.
But this shit counts.
Just what you need this time of night to be blasted out by, I've forgotten her name, Celine Dion, isn't it? That's right. I think I prefer that version of the Titanic, if I'm honest. And secondly, I am not the guy with the glasses, the author of that, or am I? No, I'm definitely not. I can't take credit for someone else's work. So the way that I try and present this stuff is to say that you can't tell people just what to do and what not to do. You've got to explain to them why they're currently doing what they're doing, the kind of errors in their thinking that lead to poor study practices. Because if you don't do that, you're not convincing them they need the stuff in the first place. So what can happen is people can just be pedalling along the road here, and the first time they know they've got a problem is when they hit the bridge. Telling you why people make these errors is equivalent to that sign there. If you hit this sign, you will hit that bridge. That's what appropriate or accurate metacognition does for you. It's an early warning system saying you're doing it wrong, you're going to fail, or you're going to get a better mark than you want. So, that's what I'm trying to do. So that's how I orientate the advice. I explain to people the kind of metacognitive errors that can lead to poor study habits and sustain them, why it's not a good idea, and then what you can do instead. I also try and keep the advice quite practical. Okay? There is a huge amount of advice out there about, obviously from psychology, that could be gained. But the problem with it is it's not written for students. It's in journals that look at memory or attention and motivation, and they leave it to you to figure out what the take-home message is. So I try and organise the advice in very obvious practical chunks, and today I've got 4 chunks for you. First chunk, how do you beat procrastination? That'll be popular with everyone, because everyone's going, I wish I knew, Paul, because it's cost me enough in my life thus far. Second thing, how do you start to read and take notes like an academic? How do you start to retain more of what you actually start to read? Thirdly, what happens when you start using appropriate methods of studying that work, but it feels like your world is falling apart? How do you convince yourself to keep going, rather than just revert to old habits? And finally, what can you take from psychology that will really help you get off to the right start with your assessed work and stop you getting a worse mark than you wanted, or even potentially failing? Okay? So, procrastination, first and foremost. Who suffers from procrastination in the room? Show of hands. Everyone, always everyone. Okay. 3 culprits behind procrastination, well, 3 main culprits. The problem with procrastination is it's got so many ways of getting its teeth into you. Firstly, we tend to procrastinate on things that we doubt our ability to do very well. It's what psychologists call perceived self-efficacy. Okay? Now, if you've had a bad experience of studying in the past and had variable results, you're probably going to start to doubt yourself. Bingo, 1 out of 3. 2, we procrastinate on things we find boring. Newsflash, folks, reading something over and over again, not particularly interesting. That's 2 out of 3. Because of those 2 out of 3 things, you're probably also going to resent doing the work, and resentment is the third part of the trifecta here, okay? And you're particularly going to resent doing it because you've got deadlines. Those deadlines are interfering with things, really inconvenient things, like your drinking schedule, for example. So that's 3 out of 3. Not good so far. But here's the doozy. Beautifully summed up by this post here. Hard work often pays off after time. Laziness pays off now, always. This is a very good way of explaining something that psychologists call hyperbolic discounting. And what it basically means is we prefer to do tasks that give us small rewards that are available right now than tasks that give us much bigger rewards, even gigantic rewards, that we get at some point, maybe, in the future. What kind of tasks do you mostly do in academia? The ones that give you the rewards right now, or the ones that you have to defer, like graduation, yeah, in the distance? Pretty much everything you do as an academic is like deferred reward, isn't it? Okay? So, procrastination has an enabler. It's called the planning fallacy. Anyone ever heard of the planning fallacy? Basically means we are useless, completely hopeless at estimating how long it will take to get something done. And of course, if you don't know how long it will take to get something done and you underestimate it, there's very little reason for you to not leave it to the last minute, because you think, I can do it at the last minute. Now, you can demonstrate this very well using poor old students as guinea pigs again. You go up to dissertation students, you say, wait, how long do you think it's going to take you to do your dissertation? They say, let's say 3 months. And you say, okay, I want 2 more estimates from you now, one of which will be your best guess. Okay, your most accurate guess, which you've already given me. Second is, if everything that can go wrong does go wrong, how long then? Sod's law estimate. Okay. Third one, if everything goes right that could go right, how long then? Best case scenario. What you then do is you compare how long they said they think it would take to how long it actually took. Guess what happens? They underestimate chronically, even in relation to their most pessimistic estimate. Now, given the role that a dissertation occupies in determining your final mark, not good news for you. Okay? And the worst thing is most of us respond to procrastination. What do we do to ourselves? We just tell ourselves off, don't we, afterwards? We're like, I always do this. Why do I leave it to the last minute? Why don't I learn my lesson with this stuff? Do you think that works? Maybe we should all get ourselves a Shia LaBeouf. Remember the do it guy. Maybe we should just all end up with something like this in our lives.
Oh my God, is he out there again? Hey, didn't I tell you yesterday I was calling the cops?
Yesterday, you said tomorrow. So just do it!
How are you even getting up here? That's an impossible climb.
Nothing is impossible!
Are you jumping down from the roof or something?
Do it!
I swear to God, if you're jumping down from up there...
You should get to the point.
God damn it, Shia, I'm calling the
What
cops.
are you waiting for?
I'd quite like one of those, actually, in my life, to be honest with you. But before you start going to hire Shia, because I'm sure he's very expensive, no. Research looks at self-reprimanding. It looks at forcing down people's throats, instances where they got it wrong for. It doesn't work. Okay? What can you do? Well, this is one of those very happy occasions where psychological knowledge corresponds with something your mum and dad probably told you when you were growing up. Let me give you an example. This is a very simple plan for writing an essay. Okay, sorry about the size of the text there, that's actually quite deliberate. The plan is, number 1, write essay, end of list. 3 days. 3 days to write an essay. Does that look fair enough? Presented like that, just 3 days? Someone's straight because they know full they've been bitten by experience. But I would say that that looks reasonable. People at home are going, 3 days, try 3 hours for the deadline, Paul. Same task, exactly the same task, unpacked or broken down into its component parts. Does 3 days still look reasonable, folks? Not so much anymore, does it? Now, I'm not going to read, you don't have to read all this out, it's just for effect, yeah? But if you break an essay down into its component parts, you've got to retrieve the essay question, you've got to retrieve your notes, you've got to go to the library, you've got to conduct a literature search, you've got to read the literature you've got to sort for the wheat from the chaff. I'll leave it there, you get the point, okay? Suddenly, presented like that, exactly the same task, 3 days doesn't look very long anymore, does it? In fact, you look at that and go, are you kidding me? That's a week's work now, at least, isn't it? And that's how you get around that tendency to underestimate the planning fallacy, yeah? This is what I think about 10 or 20 years of psychological research have said now. If you actually unpack a task, it's much less likely you're going to chronically underestimate how long you have to take to do it. There's another benefit for doing this, though. Remember I told you that we prefer doing tasks to give us a small reward now than a big reward later? Well, if you break a task down like this, you can have lots of small rewards in there, can't you? Rather than just one big one at the end of doing the essay. So that's a lovely 2-for-1 strategy there. Helps you get around that tendency of hyperbolic discounting, as we discussed earlier. Okay, this one's going to take some explaining, isn't it? Is it hot in here, or is it me? It is actually really hot in here, believe it or not. So, often you'll hear a lecturer say to you, reading in academia is not like reading a novel, okay? In that you don't read it from cover to cover, okay? You pick out the good bit. Can anyone see where I'm going with this? Yeah. Very uncomfortable suddenly, everyone in the room as well. So I would extend that analogy by saying academic reading isn't like reading a novel unless that novel is 50 Shades of Grey, because then you just skip to the good bits. You don't read any of the rest of it. No? Just me? Oh, come on, give me a bit of support here, everyone. Jeez. Right, OK, moving on, blimey. No fun. One of the things you often get from students is they say, look, OK, I'm overwhelmed by the amount of reading. Maybe I have to take it in by doing something that's cramming the books in there, just cramming as much in as possible. But this tends to reflect an error in thinking that we've got an almost infinite processing capacity. We don't, OK? If you have a look around the room just now, immediately you'll realise that there's way too much going on, and even in this environment, to take in simultaneously. You've got to focus in on something, haven't you? You've got to sort the wheat from the chaff and decide what you want to attend to. But you've got to do that with reading, folks, as well. One of the big problems that students often have, you say to them, why are you reading this source? Because they show this chapter and they say they're very proud of themselves. They read this source, and you're like, what did you get from it? And they're like, it was long. Yeah, it was long. I'll give you that. But what did you take from it? And they're like, I don't actually remember much, weirdly enough. And then I'll say to them, well, what did you want from it? And they'll say, what do you mean? I'll say, well, why were you reading it? And they'll say, well, you told me to. Well, OK, that's a good enough answer, but you need some sort of criteria for distinguishing between the stuff you need to attend to and the stuff you can ignore. Because otherwise, all the words in that text are equally salient. You can remember all the words in that text? Of course you're blooming not going to. OK? The cognitive psychologist in the room will now be thinking, aha, he's talking about cognitive load, isn't he? He's talking about limited processing in your working memory. Well, I won't go into that in detail, but basically what you have to do to try and reduce cognitive load, or one of the things you can do that, is to very clearly distinguish between the information that's necessary to do a task or to take something away, and the information that may be interesting but is surplus to requirements. How do you do that if you don't have any criteria for what you need to know, for sorting out the important information from the not so important information? So, my simple bit of advice and warning to you here is if you don't have any questions, the text can't give you any answers ever. You are just reading it to no ends, and you will come out feeling like you haven't learned anything, even after you've read it 5 times. Okay? Now, the reason why you have to start asking questions of text, anyone guess? Why is it so important to ask questions? What does it snap you out of if you're asking questions, or what does it snap you into? Any suggestions? You're doing it now. You're thinking. Yes, you're actively interacting with the text, and the degree of active interaction is that much greater. If I ask you a question now you don't know the answer, you immediately start to think about it, didn't you? Do I have anything up here that could be vaguely useful? Okay. Now, this is really important because questions, explanations, are the key to unlocking your memory. Okay. Questions are the catalyst for thinking. Thinking is, if you like, what determines what you remember. Beautiful quote by Daniel Willingham once, who said that memory is the residue of thought. So what you think about determines what you remember. Okay? So that's why passive rereading doesn't work, folks, because you're not thinking about anything. Okay? So what can you do about this? So it's all well good me saying think about stuff, but is there a method you could use that will help you achieve that? Yes, there is. Called elaborative interrogation. Anyone ever heard of it before? Nope? Okay, now here's what you do. Break down your reading into smallest chunks. So if you're reading a book chapter, maybe a paragraph at a time. Try and think about something you want to get from the text. Maybe you want to learn about a particular theorist or a theory. Maybe you want to learn about a particular experiment or study. Or, you know, if you're studying something outside of psychology, maybe the work of an author. Okay, but have something. Then, as you're reading the text, what you want to do is every time you encounter something that you, A, don't understand, like a term, you, B, it makes an assertion about something that should be justified. Or maybe C, you think, I could perhaps explain that a bit better myself, or I want to go and explain that. You make a note. You actually write a question to yourself. If the book belongs to you, you can write it on the book. If it belongs to the library, for the love of God, don't. The librarians will not thank you for it. Okay? But that's what you want to do. You want to start annotating the text with questions that you then have to answer. Because the question catalyses the thought, The thinking about it gives you the answer. That makes you much more likely to remember it. Okay? That's simple, pretty strategy, yeah? Now, I would say that at this point, don't fall into the trap of thinking, I'll summarise it instead. The reason that summarisation is regarded as something which is pretty low utility when it comes to learning, it can work, but it depends how well you do it. Have you all seen Batman, The Dark Knight? Okay, the one with you know the Joker and Batman though, yeah? Okay. Well, if I asked you to summarise, give me a plot synopsis of Batman, The Dark Knight now, you might talk about, you know, the symbiotic relationship between good and evil and what happens when one side gets ratcheted up beyond the ability of the other side. You might talk about the potential of corruption and despair to corrupt a man's character, the role of Harvey Two-Face in that movie. I'll tell you how a website called Postmodern Barney summarised Batman, The Dark Knight. The following way. Wealthy man assaults the mentally ill. Okay, it was quite funny, but it's not really, if you wanted to remember what happened in that film, it's not really a good way of doing it, is it? What I would suggest instead is rather than focus on summarisation, you ask questions that require explanation. An easy cheat to do that is ask questions that begin with why and how, because that forces you to explain the mechanism of something. And that tends to involve a lot deeper thinking than just describing something or trying to just concisely summarise something. Okay? Now, at this point, you might be thinking, that's all well and good, Paul, but what if I don't really like the topic that much? Or what if I don't already know much about it to nest the questions in? They've actually looked at that in the research. Okay? They take perceived interest in a topic, ratings from students, and they also test students for how much they already know, and they compare those students to other students that know a lot and really like the topic. And actually, this method works a little bit better on people that aren't really interested in the topic and also don't know much about it. So no excuses, give it a go. Okay? Note-taking in the 21st century, I love that meme. I've actually seen that happen in classes as well. The problem with this, I think it represents two fundamental misunderstandings. The first is that the purpose of academia is to reproduce knowledge. Look, folks, if all we did was try to reproduce knowledge from older and wiser people, academia would die on its arse in about a year. Okay? It's no good. We can't progress if all we're doing is regurgitating stuff. Okay? There has to be some element of reinvention. There has to be some element of, okay, what are the holes in this? What don't we know from understanding this? What are the other interpretations that could be brought to bear here? Okay? That's the way you generate new questions, and new questions generate new knowledge. But the more insidious thing is I think it also reflects a misunderstanding about how your memory works. A lot of people tend to think about memory as working a bit like one of those recalcitrant Victorian cameras. You know the ones in the Wild West where you saw the person disappear behind a curtain, and then he gets people in front and says, right, you have to stand there and don't move for about half an hour, because if you move, the shot's ruined. That sometimes feels like how your memory works, isn't it? It's this crappy old camera where maybe if you stare at something long enough, it will actually sink into that bloody brain of yours. Okay? Fundamentally not how memory works, and if you try and study in that way, you are going to not have a good time. Your memory works on a reconstructive basis, not a reproductive basis. We've known this, folks, since about 1920 from psychology. Give you a very simple synopsis of the study. It's called The War of the Ghosts, and it involved Westerners being given, I think, an Inuit Indian folk tale, which obviously was culturally very, very unfamiliar to them. It was also written in a very strange style that didn't really seem to have a structure as we would understand it. And what the experimenter said is, can you remember? Just read it a couple of times, then have a go at recalling it. Not surprisingly, people didn't do the best job in the world of recalling it. But what they found is that people weren't making random errors. They were making systematic errors. And these errors seem to have common themes. So if someone encountered something unfamiliar, they would either omit it or they would change it to something that meant the same thing but was culturally familiar to them. Okay? If someone encountered something that was very familiar, they would expand upon it. Okay? And that's because of this reconstructive nature of memory. Okay? What your memory is looking for is integration. It wants to see how what you're trying to learn fits in with what you already know, your previous experiences, and your expectations. So you have to study in a way that is commensurate with that. Okay? This is why we say, don't just look at your notes and copy out verbatim. I know it feels like a lot of busy work. You end up with all these notes and you think, I've done a lot there. And I know when you highlight something and you highlight a lot, you look at the page and you think, I've done a lot of work here, haven't I? Like the highlighter works like a Sainsbury's scanner straight into your brain, okay? It feels like work, but never mistake activity for achievement. Not the same thing, okay? It doesn't work. So the thing that I'm going to tell you about now is a shortcut to trying to create your own understanding of something rather than just trying to reproduce what someone else has said. Okay? That's absolutely vital. So, how do you do this? Anyone heard of 3R before? Oh, a couple of nods. Good, excellent. That's kind of bad because you know what's coming, I suppose, but good in that some of you have heard of it. A very simple method of reading and note-taking that will force you to start interrogating things and also explaining them in your own words. Again, break your source down into small chunks, okay? Paragraph at a time. Read. I'm sorry, there is no skipping the read step, folks. You've got to do that bit. There is a reason they say you have to read for a degree. Okay, again, if you can think of something you want to get out of it, all the better, okay? But read it. Put the text to one side. Do not cheat. It's not going to feel good, I warn you now. You're going to muck it up the first couple of times, but put the text to one side. Try and recite what you've just read. You can do it verbally. I would suggest you do it in writing because that then starts to form the basis of your notes. Once you've done that, compare what you've written down to what's in your source. Now, this is very important. Do not get caught up with, oh, I can't write as well as them, or that doesn't sound as good. Doesn't matter. What you are trying to do is just to explain something roughly in your own words. If you've got your facts correct, and if you've captured the essence of the main point of that passage of text, good enough. Okay? That's your litmus test. Once you can do that, move on to the next section, and you rinse and repeat. Okay? I know it sounds onerous. It's really not. Okay? And what you're doing is, as you start to progress with this, and you start to get evidence, you can remember some of this stuff, it reinforces you, and you don't mind doing more reading, because you actually get some evidence you're doing it properly. Okay? Next section, persevering. What do you do when things go, well, things feel like they're going wrong for you? This poster that I've got on the screen is more than just an excuse to get some casual nudity into the presentation. Although we always like a bit of casual nudity, don't we? Let's be honest. So, the reason I've got this are there's some very interesting parallels between bodybuilding and using your memory. Okay? Now, if any of you lift weights at the gym, or you know someone that lifts weights, yeah? You know the basic principle, right? The weights are resistance. You have to put a lot of effort in to overcome the resistance, and sooner or later you will fail. You will no longer be able to lift that weight anymore. So we've got resistance, effort, and failure. These concepts are very important for memory, because when you work out, the idea is you work out hard enough that you fail. You then go home with horrible DOMs, your muscles ache like crazy. What's happening is you've put micro tears in your muscles that your body then has to repair. But it doesn't just repair you and restore you to how you were before, it makes you that little bit stronger. So you're a bit more capable of lifting that weight next time. Do that enough and you get a lot stronger. Okay? So the failure is actually a catalyst for growth. Very important concept. Okay, we'll come back to that. What you have to remember is when you start using some of these strategies I'm telling you about, it ain't going to feel good at first. Okay? What's probably going to happen is you're going to kick that metacognitive error I told you about at the start. It's going to feel like it's hard work, and you will assume it's not working for that reason. If any of you have ever been to the theatre or seen a theatre production, you'll be aware of a saying that says, if the dress rehearsal goes badly, the play goes well. You ever thought about what that means? Because it sounds like a bad idea. If the dress rehearsal goes badly, everyone starts to panic and the whole thing will be a nightmare, yeah? That's not what happens. If the dress rehearsal goes badly, your attention is brought to the things about the production that don't work. If you know what doesn't work, you can fix it. Same with studying. If you know what you don't know, you can do something about it. If you don't know what you don't know, you remain in ignorance. Okay? The temptation, however, is you think, screw this is a lot of work. I'm going to go back, I'll look at the source for a bit, I'll just cheat. Any of you ever used cue cards for an exam? Does this sound familiar? The cue cards you can do, you read, you answer, you put them to the back of the pile, yeah? The ones you can't answer, you're like, don't need that one anymore. We'll just ignore that, pretend it didn't happen, okay? Cheating. But that information is valuable to you, and by pocketing that card, you've just deprived yourself of a key element of learning, okay? Now, I'm going to show you a very quick example of the left-hand side. It's going to seem a bit like... This is a word pairing paradigm. You get a cue word, which is the prompt, okay? Think of it, if you like, as a question. And you get the target word, which is an answer, okay? That's what you expect people to remember. So we've got two word pairs here. In the first pair, the cue word is fire. Second word is blaze. Okay? The second pairing, the Q word, is reversed. The Q word is blaze, second word is fire. Do you think it would be equally easy to remember those two word pairs? Do you think you'd stand a roughly equal chance of remembering those two? Who thinks yes? They seem about the same when it comes to the test. I'm seeing nods around the room. Okay? Think about it for a second. If I say the word fire now, what's the first word that comes to mind? It's not blaze, is it? Fire exit, maybe fire escape, firefighter, any of those words. Fire axe, okay? Fire wall. Blaze is somewhere down the list, isn't it? Look at the second one. If I say the word blaze to you, can anyone think of another word apart from fire? I can't. And it's not just because it's up there. That immediately evokes fire, doesn't it? So what you should do, having looked at this, is realise that when you're tested, when all you've got left is the Q word, that's going to be a damn sight harder to remember. Okay? Similarly, when you've got your books in front of you and you've got the question and the answer in front of you, seems easy, doesn't it? Okay? What's going to happen when I take that source and all you're left with is the questions? It's not going to be easy anymore, is it? This is the kind of it's hard to believe, I know, but this is the kind of mistake we make when we're studying. As obvious as it sounds, we make mistakes this fundamental. Okay? Now, what do you do about it? Okay? By the way, if you're interested, this is presumably a chemistry or physics exam here. Briefly explain what hard water is. If you want to have a go at that, feel free, by the way. I'll tell you what the answer is afterwards. What you need to do is just start to not view testing as something that's done to you at the end of a module, but something you do as an integral part of your learning. Okay? It's utilising something in psychology we call the testing effect. Now, the testing effect is one of those gems in psychology, and what I mean by that, it's one of the things no one ever argues with. Because we're an argumentative bunch in psychology. Rarely do you find a finding that just seems to hold regardless. The testing effect means if you had two groups of people, you give them a source to read, you say to the first group, 20 minutes, read this as many times as you want, there'll be a test at the end. Second group, you say to them, same source, read it through, and then we're going to give you a series of tests, and then see how you do in the final test. Okay? Second group will always do better. It's better to test yourself for an amount of time than reread for the same amount of time. Okay? Now, that might seem like a complete chore to you, but the reason it works is because, well, you're asking for evidence of what you know. And if you test yourself and you know you don't know something, you can do something about it. Dress rehearsal goes badly, real thing goes well. Here's where it gets interesting, and that parallel to bodybuilding comes in again. Research seems to suggest that the biggest results we get from trying to remember something are just on that cusp when we're about to fail, as if we're trying to lift a weight and we're like, oh, God, you sod, sort of thing, you know. It's a bit like that with memory as well. The more effort you have to put in, the more able you seem to be to remember something afterwards, okay? It doesn't even stop there. You say, but what when you fail? That's bad, surely. No, that's the other part of it, which is where the comparison to bodybuilding comes in. Failure, when it comes to memory, just as failure when it comes to weightlifting, is not a bad thing. Your memory benefits from successful and unsuccessful attempts to retrieve information. Okay? It doesn't feel that way, does it? When you can't remember something, you think, oh, that's a waste of everyone's time and effort. But actually, that's not the case, because again, failing to recall something serves as a metacognitive correction. You now know you don't know that. So when you go back to your reading, you've got a priority suddenly, haven't you? You now know what you know and what you don't know, and therefore what you need to focus on. So what you need to do is, when you feel that urge and you think, look, this is going terrible, I can't remember anything, don't give up. That is a catalyst for growth. That is not an indictment. That means you're making progress, even if it doesn't feel like it. Okay? That's the answer that came up on the exam. What is hard water? Ice. I love that. I don't think that's the answer they were going for. Can you see what I mean about it? It does say explain what hard water is. Not all answers are created equal. So when you are retrieving things, do try and explain them rather than just give a one-word answer. Last bit I want to give you advice on today. Producing assessed work. There is one thing you can do right from the outset that will really help you in this regard. It might even save you a few fouls here and there. Quite often when students are producing work, what they don't think about is there a gap between my expectations about what constitutes a good piece of work and the tutor, i.e. the person who's marking your work expectations. Okay? What tends to happen is students just accelerate past that. They're like, not happening, it's fine, hit the accelerator, get on with the work. You haven't got very long. Okay? I like to think it's a bit like that meme there. Just speed up, you got this, okay? No, you don't. If you don't know what the expectations are, just speeding past that doesn't mean you clear the gap. It means you hit the gap faster and harder, okay? What you need to do here, because what we're talking about is grading criteria. We're talking about understanding what the expectations are so you can ensure that your work is fit for purpose. Because if it's not fit for purpose, we can guess what happens. Now, at this point, it's not just students that do this. I'm going to tell you about my favourite overheard academic conversation. And you're duty-bound to keep this quiet, he says as he broadcasts it live to how many hundreds of people offline. This was after I'd been to a presentation. It was a collection of very senior colleagues. One of them was given a presentation about a topic, I don't recall what it was, which is not a good start. They gave their presentation. It did not really go down well. They clearly wasn't fit for purpose. They went to sit down in the audience because another person was coming up to give a talk. This was the conversation I heard. Professor A, was that presentation difficult to write? Professor B, looking slightly puzzled. No, why? Professor A, because it was effing hard to sit through. If anyone laughs too much about that and applies it to my presentation, I'll start to worry, okay? Still to this day, my favourite overheard presentation quote. So feel free to use that whenever the next time you see a bad presentation, incidentally. Just don't use it at the end of mine, hopefully. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example. This is an extract from marking criteria. Those of you that are at UEL will recognise this as part of our essay marking criteria. Okay? Very simple, addressing the question. This is one of 7 criteria we use to mark your work with. On the right-hand side, a description of what you would need to do to get a first, because everyone wants a first, right? Okay, content is clearly relevant to the topic set and convincingly addresses the essay title or question. Does that sound okay? Does that sound clear? Do you all get it? Do you all understand it? Sort of, you know it's a trap, don't you? But you kind of, I bet you're thinking, yeah, I kind of get it, Paul, okay? The danger here is that we have another metacognitive error. We tend to prematurely assume we understand something just because we can remember it. It's not a two-way street there. It's really weird because you can remember something and not understand it, but it's actually quite difficult to understand something and not remember it, okay? Because you think you thought about it. That's what helps. So I always like the latest in a series of copyright infringements, folks, the latest Simpson clip. This is, I think, very well illustrated by Homer Simpson here.
To run a few tests. This is a simple lie detector. I'll ask you a few yes or no questions, and you just answer truthfully. Do you understand?
Yeah.
You laugh. I once had a session with level 6 students who were doing their dissertation. I was giving them advice on how to do their dissertation. I started the session off by saying, you're all familiar with the marking criteria, right? And they all went, yep, 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 yep. I said, okay, which of you can give me just one example? Just tell me one of the criteria we use. And suddenly they all went. So, yeah, did a Homer Simpson, basically. Now, there's a problem with this. If you've rushed to judgment and you think you understand that marking criteria quickly, what if you're wrong? How can you orientate a piece of work to a marking criteria that you do not understand? How can you bridge that expectation gap? Okay? The reality is you can't. So, what we need to do here is give you a better criteria for making a judgment about whether you really understand the grading criteria, and then I'll give you a study method you can use to help you out. Okay? Again, same criteria that we agreed everyone seems to think they understand. Sadler, an oldie but a goodie here, would say you don't understand this unless you can do the following 3 things. This is the criteria you use from now on to see whether you understand grading criteria. Could you recognise that? Would you really recognise a first-class piece of work with respect to addressing the question? We've already got people shaking their heads. Blimey, that's a bit where you should go, yeah, I can do that. Okay, well, that's fine, that's fine. Having recognised that exemplar, could you use that to evaluate your own work? So to what extent am I doing what that person is doing there? This is where people start to go, not really. And then, having made that comparison, could you use that comparison as the basis for improving your work? Yeah. Suddenly that question about do you understand the grading criteria becomes a bit more complicated, folks, doesn't it? Who still thinks they understand that now? Yeah, lots of, oh God, no, why did you do this to me, Paul? It's too late in the evening for this. Okay, I'll tell you what you do. How do you think lecturers get good at this? Practice. What do you think you need to do? Peer evaluation. Okay? Now, some of you might have this kind of exercise in class. What the tutor does is they make up fake exemplars of work that have achieved certain standards. They ask the students to mark that work, and then they use that in producing their own work so they can actually benefit from understanding the grading criteria. Lo and behold, the students that do that get better marks. Okay? So what I would suggest you do now, if you haven't got this kind of exercise in class, start applying the grading criteria to examples of your previous work. Okay? You're not attached to it anymore, you'll rip it to pieces. Brilliant. Start, if the tutor gives you exemplars to use those. Attach the marking criteria to that. How about when you're producing a piece of work, rather than just submitting it and hoping for the best, how about you actually try and mark it yourself, run it past the tutor and say, I know you can't tell me what mark you would give, but this is where I think I roughly am in terms of how I'm achieving these marking criteria. Do you think I'm on the right lines? Because wink, wink, nudge, nudge, they probably will tell you that. Okay? A bit of a warning here. Do not compare work you're currently doing with other students. You mustn't swap work you're currently doing. That's collusion. Okay? But if a tutor gives you a piece of work and says you can use this, previous work of yours and that's okay. Right, some take-home messages, because I've no idea what we're doing for time, probably hideously overrun, hopefully not too bad. Here's the first thing. Hopefully you've spotted a recurrent pattern here. A lot of the advice I've given you is one, very basic, and two, occurs quite early on in the process of studying. So let's recap. How to avoid procrastinating. When you're planning a task, i.e. in the early stages, make sure that you break it down. When you're reading, have some point to doing the reading. Ask some questions. Again, right at the start, very basic. When you're doing notes, okay, understand the way your memory works. Very basic, do it right at the start. When we're talking about persevering, don't be put off when you initially, i.e. right at the start, don't do very well. Very basic, very early. Okay? And lastly, if we're just talking about grading criteria, the first thing you should be doing before you do a piece of work, looking at the grading criteria. Very basic, very simple. But if you do not do these things or you get them wrong, that's what happens. Everything that follows is probably going to be a bit off too. Okay? There is, however, a flip side to that. Just a few quite small changes early on in the way that you approach studying can also mean that doesn't happen. You don't have to put a huge amount of work or effort in, but it can change the knock-on effect that would otherwise occur. Second thing I'd like you to remember is from now on, it doesn't matter what you think you know, it's what you can prove you know that matters. Okay? Ask for evidence of your knowledge. Don't trust your intuition, because your intuition is wrong. We tend to flatter to deceive ourselves when it comes to what we know and how competent we are. So I would suggest that what will often happen is these metacognitive errors I've told you about is a bit like joining this line here. They tell you comforting stuff that you'll like, but it's wrong, it's lies. And you'll only find out usually when you get to the assessment. Okay? Instead, get in this line, which is always the least popular one. Okay? As Wittgenstein once said, you know, there's no greater challenge or nothing so difficult as not deceiving oneself. This is what you have to become good at, folks. And the way you do that is by using evidence. Same thing we teach you to do in your subject areas. Finally, I would say you're going to have to be proactive. Those of you that are UEL, by all means do this. Those of you from different institutions, you spend most of your time as a student at higher education studying what? Studying in the classroom or studying independently? Studying at home, studying independently. Therefore, you need to pay as much attention to how you go about that process as you do what happens when you're in the classroom. Equally, your university should be paying as much attention to what you do when you're outside of the classroom as inside the classroom. And that is not always a given, folks. You've all heard of the Teaching Excellence Framework, yeah? Here's a shocker for you. That's one of the metrics on which universities, the quality of their teaching and learning environment is assessed. Ian's getting very nervous probably now. What I'll say here is the last version of the TEF, because it's been revised, there is a new version. Ian, you can tell me if this has now been addressed. Do you think there was real provisions about assessing how much support a university gave people for independent studying? Well, if there was, I looked up on the public website of 6 institutions, 6, that were awarded TEF Gold. So Ian, jump in here. That is nationally excellent environments for teaching and learning, isn't it? These nationally excellent environments for teaching and learning on the sites that are designed to support student and their independent studying were promoting none other than learning styles. That thing I told you right at the start was nonsense. So you should all pile down to universities, teaching and support centres now and say, how is what you're doing informed by the psychology of effective studying? Just do me a favour there, that will help. But it's a very serious thing because you need to. Because universities are understandably very concerned about the metrics that drive the system. But these do not always correspond with what works. Student satisfaction surveys, all well and good. How good do you think the correlation between what is popular and what is right is? What do you think university is going to err on the side of? Doing what's popular and we'll get good satisfaction, or doing what's right? Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? And this is one of the reasons why telling people about metacognitive processes is so important, because that's how you reconcile it. If you suddenly say to students, more tests, they'll go, boo, NSS, foul, yeah? But if you say, this is the reason why you need to test yourself during the process of studying, this is how we support you, suddenly, university's doing a good job. This is what makes it so important. So this is the first thing you need to do, be proactive in getting support from university. If you find that's lacking, or you just really like me or what I do, then, I do have some stuff, please buy the book. Or just subscribe to the website. But whatever you do, what I would say here is pay attention to that quote at the top. You may be muddling along, you may be getting a mark that you think is good enough, you may be on track to what you think will be an acceptable degree. Don't ask yourself, is what I'm doing okay thus far? Ask yourself, how much better could I be doing if I just invested a bit more time studying in a way that was informed by psychology? And I think that's a good point on which to leave it, folks. But before I do, I will leave the last person to the person that always gets the last word in my house, my son. So, thank you for your kind attention, folks. How badly did I overrun, James?
Thank you, just on time. I'm going to invite, I hope you'll indulge me, I'm going to invite John Radford to have the final word of the evening. Over to you, John.
Yes, thank you. Well, I wasn't really expecting, I won't say unexpected as unaccustomed as I am to public speaking. I'm very accustomed to it, or used to be. But first of all, I'd like to thank Paul for such a very clear and informative talk, and which does, of course, chime in with many things I've always felt. But the point is this, one point I want to make is this, that many of the things that he said about good teaching and good learning have probably been said off and on by good teachers through the centuries, probably since formal education began, which was probably about 8,000 years ago. And the difference now is we now can tell why something works and why it doesn't work. And that is a big difference that psychology makes for everything. So much of what is done, government policy downwards, if that's the way, or upwards to government policy, is based on what people think will work. I mean, look at the recent, they thought that the mini budget would work, but it didn't. But I don't say psychologists could not have made that mistake, but they made a mistake because they simply thought it would work. And that goes through such a lot of policy from government down to everyday life. But psychology does provide you with the means of finding out what does work, not what people just think it works. Now, I just had one of the things I used to do, well, two of the things I used to do was talk to beginning students and to nearly finishing students. These are traditional tasks to a head of department. And in the beginning, I would say some things are similar to what Paul has said, but without all the backup that he's been able to provide now. But in preparing for exams, which will come at the end of the course, one of the things I said was this, which I think does chime in with what Paul said. If you ask teachers in higher education across the world, what is the single mistake that causes students not to score better marks in their exams? I'm pretty sure, without testing it, I'm pretty sure the answer would be they do not answer the question. And that's what I try to give people practice in doing. The way to practice is just as Paul said. You can practice that, you can learn how to do it. And one of my little hobby horses is that one of the reasons they don't answer the question is because they haven't been taught to answer questions. They've been taught to write essays. That's not the same thing at all. what we want is not, what I want is not a good essay, but a good answer. Is this, or is what they say relevant? And my simple technique was doing it, but again I think this counters very well with it. Faced with a question on the exam or other, imagine that somebody's asking you the question because they want to know the answer. You shall have to compare and contrast with what is the use of, say, Freud's psychoanalysis or something. It's asked you by somebody who is saying to you, well, you're a student of psychology, what is the answer? Why is one better than the other? Why is one better? Why do these experiments work? And that person should be someone who's interested but doesn't know very much about psychology. They know it should have the answers. They want to know what is the answer. Instead, the tendency is to learn to write essays, write a nice set of comments about the question. Instead of saying, well, and another technique to get over that is to say, and I used to use this in exam preparation sessions, what is your one-sentence answer? Here's the question, what are you going to say? What is your one-sentence answer? Quickly, write it down. Then you can see where you're going. However, I'll just then, I won't run on, which I usually don't tend to do, but I'll just add one little bit of journalistic advice. An older journalist advising a young starting out reporter, he said, well, what you do to write a good piece of journalism is consider the question, write a good opening paragraph which sets the scene and describes the issues, then write what you found out, then write a final paragraph which sums it up and comes to a conclusion. And then take a pair of scissors and cut off the first and the last paragraph. And that's your journalism. And it's also, very often, your answer.
Thank you very much, John. Wisdom as ever. So that's the end of this evening's session. Everybody here is invited to join us for a drink if they want and some afters in the fishbowl, which is just literally out this door on the right-hand side. Thank you to everybody who's online for joining us. I appreciate you doing so. And most of all, thank you very much to Paul Farnley for that very interesting talk.